Okay, so I'm gonna give just a couple of introductions and thanks, introduce Josh, and then we'll get going, and people who are joining can still join. Hi, everyone. My name's John Gershman. I teach at the Wagner School here at NYU, and the Conflict, Security, and Development series is a joint collaboration between the International Education Program at Steinhardt, the Center for Global Affairs at the School of Professional Studies, the graduate program on international relations in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the Law School. We're all very excited that you're able to join our opening session for the fall of 2023 in this series. Just a couple of logistical reminders. If people can please post questions throughout in the Q&A, and I'll throw them to Josh during the Q&A period. Our speaker today is Joshua Busby, who is a distinguished scholar at the Strauss Center and a non-resident fellow with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and a senior research fellow at the Center for Climate and Security at UT Austin. He was on leave in 2021 to 2022, serving as a senior advisor for climate at the U.S. Department of Defense, and was serving there in a part-time capacity in that role until this past June. Josh has published widely on a range of issues in international relations. His first two books, Moral Movements and Foreign Policy, and AIDS, Drugs for All, Social Movements and Market Transformation. And we're very excited he'll be presenting on his third book called States and Nature, The Effects of Climate Change on Security. Without further ado, Josh.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you all, and terrifically appreciative of the invitation. I'm going to share my screen and walk through the book, States and Nature, The Effects of Climate Change on Security, which came out from Cambridge last year. In my talk, what I wanted to do is give you a bit of background on my work in this space, review the approach of the book, talk about the chapter on Myanmar and Bangladesh, and then conclude with some implications for policy, and then open it up for questions. I kind of got into this space almost accidentally, almost 20 years ago. I was a pre-doctoral fellow at the Brookings Institution, and then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan came to me and Nigel Purvis, who's a former diplomat, to write a short paper on what climate change meant for security in the international system and for the UN, and that was in 2004. And subsequent to that, I started writing more in this space, and I did a couple of papers, one for the Council on Foreign Relations in 2007, which also was accompanied by a security studies piece, and then subsequently did a number of research projects that were funded by the U.S. Department of Defense under its Minerva initiative, one on climate change and African political stability, and another on complex emergencies and political stability in Asia. And along the way have published in think tanks and academic outlets on this topic. And this all culminated in the book that came out last year. It also led to my appointment, as you heard, from 2021 to 2023 as a senior climate advisor at the U.S. Department of Defense. And I worked on some of these analytical products that you see in the slide, one, the DoD's climate risk analysis, and also integrating climate into the national defense strategy, and happy to the extent I can talk about that in the Q&A. But what really animated this project on some level was a comment that was made by Mark Levy, who's now at Columbia University at the Earth Institute. He made a comment in an exchange with Thomas Homer Dixon in the 1990s when early literature on environmental security emerged. And that literature mostly consisted of single qualitative case studies that analyzed the connections between environmental degradation and violent conflict. And these single case studies, there were a whole bunch of them that Homer Dixon and his colleagues had assessed to try and tease out the causal mechanisms connecting environmental degradation to violence. And Mark noted that the more logical research strategy under the circumstances would be to compare societies facing similar environmental problems, but exhibiting different levels of violent conflict. And that would permit some precision in identifying the conditions under which environmental degradation generates violent conflict and when it does not. And as far as I could tell, there hadn't been anyone, or perhaps only a handful of researchers who took markup on this methodological challenge. And when the second debate on climate security emerged in the mid 2000s, most of it was sort of a quantitative nature, large N statistical studies, very few qualitative case studies. And of the case studies that were out there, most of them were the gray literature, looking at a handful of individual cases like the conflict in Darfur or the conflict in Syria. No one had taken countries that were similarly exposed to climate hazards and assessed why some had negative security outcomes and others didn't. And so that was really the animating question for this book. And I can talk about why I talk about climate change or climate hazards specifically and negative security outcomes over the course of the talk, or expand on that in the Q&A. So what I wanted to do in terms of the ambition of the book is have a set of paired cases with broad geographic coverage, so that much of the early literature in the climate security debate was focused on sub-Saharan Africa. I wanted to have a wider geographic coverage than that. I also wanted to broaden our understanding of security and not simply be about violent conflict, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But I also wanted a general argument, maybe hubris on my part, but I wanted an argument that could explain a range of phenomenon, including but not limited to conflict, and also do what the quantitative literature on climate security hadn't really done all that well, which is unpack the causal mechanisms connecting cause and effect. So that's really the sort of approach of the book, but I'll say a little bit more about it in a second. So in terms of paired cases, as I said, I wanted to identify countries that faced similar exposure to climate hazards, but experienced different security outcomes. So why did Somalia experienced famine after severe drought, but neighboring Ethiopia did not? Why did Syria have a civil war after severe drought, but neighboring Lebanon did not? Why did Myanmar experience severe loss of life after exposure to an extreme cyclone, but neighboring Bangladesh and India did not? I also, in this approach, take advantage of within case variation. So you can look at countries like Ethiopia and Bangladesh and compare them to themselves over time. So Ethiopia in the 1980s had a devastating drought that led to famine, but by the 2010s, very few people died after severe droughts. Similarly, Bangladesh at its founding, as you'll hear more about, had extreme loss of life after severe cyclones, and even up to the 1990s had severe loss of life, but over time has diminished the risk of loss of life when severe cyclones strike. And I'll talk more about that in a second, because this is the case that I want to spend a little bit of time on in my remarks today, but I'm happy to talk about the other cases in the Q&A. As I said, I wanted a more expansive definition of security, not simply one that explained armed conflict. And our traditional understanding of security is of an armed external attack by another country. And that sort of expanded as we started to think about non-state actors, and we've just had the 22nd anniversary of the attacks of 9/11. We understand that there are other kinds of external threats that can rise to the level of security challenges that come about from non-state actors. But we should also remember that it's not the agency of foreign threats that escalates to a security challenge. It's the severity of their impacts, and that's the argument that I make in this book, that there are a host of other what the field talks about as actorless threats, problems like disease, like the COVID-19 epidemic, or like climate change, that rise to the level of potential security impacts, whether or not they contribute to conflict. It's the severity of their impacts that really distinguishes them. And so, what I think is important is that is not the agency of some external or internal attacker that matters, but the severity of the impact of the problem. And that's what distinguishes security threats from other kinds of problems. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So as I said, I wanted a general argument that could explain a range of phenomenon, including but not limited to conflict. So let me say a bit about that. The argument in brief is that states that have high capacity will have more trouble responding to climate hazards. States that have low capacity will have more trouble responding to climate hazards. The second dimension is political inclusion. States with politically exclusive regimes are less likely to respond to climate hazards with support for all at-risk groups. And the third dimension is getting at the role of international assistance. States that block foreign aid or allocate it in a biased manner are likely to have worse outcomes. I'm going to unpack each of these in turn. But again, the aspiration for the book is one that can explain a range of phenomenon, including but not limited to violent conflict. So let me expand on each of these pieces in turn. So in terms of capacity, here I'm talking about infrastructural capacity, the capacity of states to deliver services. States need to be able to mobilize resources and carry out service delivery to prepare for and respond to climate hazards. And not all states are as well positioned to do that. And I'll show how I try to operationalize it in the case that I'll talk about in a little bit. But this is the first dimension. It draws on the work of Fukuyama, Michael Mann, the late Andrew Price Smith, among others. The second dimension, which also builds on the literature that's emerged in climate security on the role of political inclusion and the wider literature in political economy on exclusive regimes, gets at this notion that some regimes are better positioned to provide support for all groups in society. Exclusive regimes that leave key groups out of decision-making are more likely to ignore or discriminate against certain groups. And here, this is a refinement, I think, on using concepts like regime type. You may have heard about Amartya Sen's classic argument that famines don't happen in democracies. Well, I think regime type could be a useful way of getting at the sort of scope conditions, or when to think about when environmental hazards lead to negative security outcomes. But what we've seen is a number of regimes that are not fully democratic or only partially democratic, but that are reasonably inclusive or were reasonably inclusive. And I think the Ethiopian regime up until recently was emblematic of that. The Bangladesh case is also somewhat indicative of that. And so in my work, I think political inclusion is a more useful concept beyond regime type to get at what are the institutional dynamics that lead to service delivery to groups in times of need. So if the first dimension of state capacity gets at the ability of states to provide support, the second dimension really gets at their willingness to provide support for all groups in society. And I'll talk more about how I operationalize political inclusion in the next segment. But it really gets at whether or not regimes prepared to provide support to groups in times of need when they're facing climate-related emergencies. But there's a third piece that's important, and it gets at the role of international assistance, and that can include both overseas development assistance and wider humanitarian assistance, which are not always tracked in the same budgets by international donors. And on some level, you can think of this as a way to compensate for state weakness in times of need, both in the immediate wake of hazard exposure. So if there's a cyclone or if there's a drought, there can be a pulse of international resources that can help a weak capacity state deliver services. But over time, it can also be the kinds of resources that can build that state capacity. But what we see is that there may be moments where that international assistance is blocked, either internally because regimes are unwilling to accept that assistance, or internationally where donors already see a state as something of a pariah and aren't willing to extend a helping hand. In either case, that blockage of assistance might mean that outcomes in that society are worse on in humanitarian level, but also worse in the potential escalation to conflict. And the reasons, and even if some regimes are willing to accept that aid, they may want to bias it to some groups and not others, and we should expect problematic outcomes in those situations. So putting the pieces together, here are my expectations when we and it's low capacity states with high political exclusion that block foreign aid or distribute it in a one-sided manner. Those are the worst case scenarios that we should expect. And then the best case scenarios are high capacity states with high political inclusion who receive aid and distribute it broadly to all social groups. And in between, there are going to be a variety of mixed cases where the outcomes are a little bit muddied, and the book has sort of typology of my expectations for those middling cases. So as I said, one of my aspirations for the book was to unpack the causal pathways connecting cause and effect, and there are different diagrams in the book. Some have shorter or longer causal chains depending on which factors we think are important, but notionally or nominally, they start out with a climate hazard, either a swift onset hazard like a cyclone, or a slow onset phenomenon like a drought. That leads to certain societal impacts in terms of impacts on lives and livelihoods. And this can be telescoped in a relatively short period of time or unfold over a period of months. There may be societal impacts with demands for redress and local contention, with groups saying, please help me. At that moment, the state has an opportunity to respond, and its response is conditioned on the level of existing state capacity and its degree of political inclusion, alongside whatever international assistance is offered. And that may, if the circumstances are poor, lead to civil or communal conflict, at least in this diagram, but it could just lead to a humanitarian emergency. There may be other steps along the way that we might want to include, such as through migration or impacts on food prices. There are at least more extensive diagrams in the book, but this is a relatively simplified causal pathway, focusing mostly on events, either those that are climate related, swift onset hazards, or slower onset ones like droughts. There are more extensive causal chains that we could think about with feedback loops, but this is telescoped over a relatively short period of time. So what I have to do in each of the chapters to make the compelling case is compare the two countries to each other, exploit within case variation. So for countries like Bangladesh that change over time, try to compare them to themselves over time. And I have to start out by showing that they both face severe climate hazards, and then code the three key variables: capacity, inclusion, and assistance, and for good measure, try to address alternative explanations. So let me walk you through how I do that. In one of the cases, the Bangladesh Myanmar case, the chapter has India in it, but for the purposes of time, I'm just going to focus on those two. So I start out by trying to document hazard exposure, and I connect it to potential security outcomes through impacts on lives and livelihoods to show that the countries both could have experienced severe impacts from this physical exposure to a climate-related hazard, but one did and the other didn't. Now, I should note that the climate hazard could be climate change related, but it's not so important to say, for example, I'm going to show you some series of cyclones that have struck Myanmar and Bangladesh. It's not so important to be able to say that particular cyclone was made more likely by climate change, but to say these are the kinds of effects we expect to see in a world of climate change. And on some level, it's a proxy for what we expect to see in the future. And I can talk about that challenge and the methodological reasons for it. I also have a new piece in a special symposium in PS that talks about the challenges of writing about the future and writing about climate change and climate security that I'm happy to talk about a little bit more in the Q&A. But that's the choice that we made. We're backward looking at historic events to say, like, this is an indicator of the kinds of things we expect to see in the future. So this is a little busy diagram, but there are a whole host of cyclones that I talk about in the chapter, all of which under conventional measures were severe cyclones in terms of the Saffir-Simpson scale and other cyclone rankings in terms of sustained winds and storm surge. They all could have potentially killed large numbers of people. The Myanmar one that I'm going to talk about killed nearly 140,000 people. The Bangladesh storm from 2007, which is kind of contemporaneous with the Myanmar storm around 2008, killed, depending on different estimates, between 3,800 and 4,200 people. But as you see, there's a previous cyclone that struck Bangladesh in 1991 that killed almost as many people, or even more, than died in Myanmar in 2008. And so what I'm able to do in this chapter is talk about both why a severe cyclone that struck Bangladesh in 2007 killed so many fewer people than Myanmar in 2008, and why Bangladesh was able to improve so much over time compared to its past in 1991 and earlier past in 1970. So part of what I do in the book through a series of maps is to show the movement of cyclones and that they passed over populated parts of both countries. It would be problematic to have severe cyclones that one passed over an unpopulated area and the other passed over a populated area. So what I try to do, at least through the maps, is to show that both of them passed over highly populated areas, and that there were potential damages in both. In the case of Bangladesh, there's still substantial economic damage, but not as many people died. And so the impacts on the economic side in Myanmar were 700,000 homeless, 3/4 of the delta's livestock were killed, half the fishing fleet sank, 1 million acres of rice paddies inundated. In Bangladesh at Wright, there were still more than $240 million in damages, including extensive damage to the rice crop and fishing boats. But the core sort of security metric that I'm interested in is differences in loss of life. And so nearly 140,000 people die in Myanmar. Meanwhile, only, and it's still a fairly significant number, but only 4,200 died by comparison in Bangladesh. So how do we understand that? That's really the sort of animating question for this particular chapter. And also the point of how Bangladesh has improved over time. So depending on different estimates, at its founding, when Bangladesh cleaved from Pakistan, one of the rationales was severe cyclone that struck Bangladesh in 1970 that killed anywhere between 300 and 500,000 people. And subsequent cyclone in 1991 that killed nearly 140,000 people. But again, depending on your different counts, anywhere between 3,300 and 4,200 died with exposure in 2007 to Cyclone Sidr, and then in subsequent cyclones, the death total has declined to even more. So how to explain that? How do we explain those differences between Myanmar and Bangladesh, and how do we explain differences between Bangladesh and itself over time? So not surprisingly, I focus on my argument, differences in capacity, inclusion, and assistance. So the sort of headline on capacity is there was limited state capacity to protect or aid citizens in Myanmar, whereas in Bangladesh, they built state capacity to respond with early warning systems. And how do we operationalize that more explicitly? I try to triangulate it in a variety of ways. One is through looking at metrics of state capacity from the World Bank and the PRS group, which are just simple kind of investor surveys of state capacity. The proxy here I'm using is bureaucratic quality. You can see top dotted line is India, has more capacity than either of them. Bangladesh is in the middle, and Myanmar is considerably lower. And I use a variety of proxies like that. But more useful in this issue space are to look at forecasting, early warning, and response. And so, in terms of forecasting capability, Myanmar lacked forecasting capability at the time of Cyclone Nargis, whereas India and Bangladesh have better forecasting capabilities. By 2018, Bangladesh was able to forecast that a cyclone was coming with 3 days anticipation. At the 2007, around this time period, for this particular case, it might not have been 3 days, it might have been 2 days, but it's still, they had some forecasting capability. But that forecasting capability was also translated into early warning, like this photo here, which depicts one of the many tens of thousands of volunteers that the Bangladesh has to notify people when they have forecast an impending cyclone. Whereas in Myanmar, not only did they lack forecasting capability, but they didn't have any early warning systems. And so, as one villager in Myanmar said, villagers were totally unaware. We knew the cyclone was coming, but only because the wind was very strong. No local authorities ever came to us with information about how serious the storm was. But as I said, there are tens of thousands of volunteers that are ready to mobilize, and there are also other kinds of things for early warning, radio programming, local community bullhorns, etc., to get the word out when there's been a forecast. But then there has to be some way of making use of that information of what to do. And what Bangladesh has done is built a number of purpose-ready cyclone shelters so that people have places to go higher ground with their animals that are gender appropriate for cultural context. And Bangladesh has built thousands of these, whereas at the time, a USAID official said in Myanmar, said they didn't have any shelters at all. Not only did they lack a weather radar network to predict cyclones, it had no early warning system or storm shelters or evacuation plans. At the time in 2007, Bangladesh had about 1,500 purpose-built shelters, each able to accommodate 5,000 people. And they've invested more than 10 billion by 2011 in embankments and shelters. So that's state capacity, but there's also differences in political inclusion. So at the time, Myanmar had a military dictatorship. They have subsequently flirted with partial democratization and then kind of gone back again. But generally the nature of the regime was responding to favored groups over others, whereas Bangladesh, not fully democratic, to be sure, but reasonably inclusive. So shelters and aid were available to most of the population that needed it. And so I try to get at that and operationalize it in terms of some measures like the ethnic power relations data set to assess what proportion of the population had formal representation in government. And so at the time, more than 30% of the population in Myanmar was formally excluded from representation, although I think that understates the degree of political exclusion in the military dictatorship. In Bangladesh, by contrast, after independence, discriminated groups never constituted more than about 11% of the population. So the government has been more inclusive in terms of political representation, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. There are some other kinds of metrics that I try to get at in this. Low indicators like Denmark represents a high degree of inclusion. Higher metrics represent more social exclusion. The top metric here is Myanmar. Bangladesh by this score doesn't look all that good, but I think that may understate the degree of political inclusion, at least by this metric, and India is somewhat intermediate, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. The last piece that I want to talk about, and then I'll talk briefly about policy implications before opening it up, is Myanmar and Bangladesh were positioned very differently with respect to foreign aid. At that time of the cyclone, the Myanmar authorities refused most international assistance, whereas Bangladesh is an international aid darling. They have, for the past 20 to 30 years made good use of international assistance, and they also did in that particular moment. So I try to get at this temporally over time. This is a little messy. This isn't scaled to the per capita, but you can see in 2008, the relatively low absolute levels of foreign aid that Myanmar, the black line at the bottom with the triangles, only after its sort of partial flirtation with democratization did substantial international aid come in. We can look at this more in terms of aid per capita. Again, India, for different reasons, sees itself as more self-reliant, is richer, and isn't especially reliant on foreign aid. But Bangladesh at the time, in per capita terms, again, looking at the sort of 2007, 2008 period, had a higher per capita rate of assistance than Myanmar. But it's putting all these pieces together, we can make the argument in full. Myanmar authorities did not warn the inhabitants, despite repeated bulletins from the Indian Meteorological Department. They didn't make warnings. They didn't respond and help people. So some local businessmen went to try to see what assistance was being provided. The assistance wasn't provided. There were no soldiers or Navy boats on the water. And the Myanmar regime did not permit significant foreign aid. So the U.S. Navy made 15 unsuccessful attempts to deliver aid, ultimately ordering its ships to depart. And so the story of Myanmar and why nearly 140,000 people died is no early warning, limited response, and rebuffing international aid efforts. Whereas Bangladesh, part of its social political compact of the ruling elite since its founding has been one of trying to safeguard the population in times of crisis, particularly in the wake of exposure to extreme weather events like cyclones. And Bangladesh has cultivated a reputation for being open to international organizations. And so that led to a tacit agreement between elites, the masses, and international aid donors to protect against the worst effects of disasters. And that has led to Bangladesh's relative success in being able to both in 2007 had a relatively low loss of life and its improvement over time. Now, I should address alternative explanations. Myanmar didn't have a history of cyclones, and so one might say perhaps that simply accounts for the differences in the experience that Bangladesh has learned the hard way over time and improved. And there's something to be said for that, but they had warning and they didn't act. They had an opportunity to respond, but did not. And they also had an offer for help, and they thwarted that. And that's one reason why the death toll was as severe as it was. And we can talk about the adequacy of this as an alternative explanation, but I want to spend a couple of minutes on the policy implications and then open this up for your questions. So I think one thing that comes out of this work is that, there's a bit of a doom mindset that has come into climate circles, that some amount of warming is inevitable, and that's true. And there's a worry that people might throw up their hands and say, we can't do. I mean, we've had instances in recent days like Libya with severe flooding, with extreme loss of life, and that isn't. That's not determined, but there are opportunities for focused investments by states to plan for and prepare for extreme weather events that even in a world where those hazards are accelerating and becoming more intense, that there are focused investments in state capacity that can reduce vulnerability to climate hazards, and that international aid can help finance that. And so that's something that we shouldn't accept, like the tragic events that we've observed in Libya over the last couple of days. That doesn't have to happen, right? And Bangladesh's experience over time is a testament to the ability by states and international donors together to plan for and prepare for these risks and diminish the impacts over time. The other policy implication is that political inclusion is more difficult for outsiders to build. And there was a recent story in the New York Times about how Bangladesh is throttling the role of opposition parties through court cases. There's real risks that in the absence of domestic commitment to fostering political inclusion over time, that that can be eroded. And that's in the U.S. has learned the hard way through his experience in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, that it's difficult for outsiders to have influence over some of these processes in the absence of domestic commitment. The other thing is that, as I said, the progress can be upended. So even as international assistance can help build state capacity, we've seen of late in Tigray and Ethiopia, that's a country that has made incredible progress in weathering and preparing for droughts. But there's now extreme famine risk in that country, in part because of the erosion of political inclusion and the rise of violence and civil conflict. So that means that we have to have a theory of state building and what the role of international assistance is in this process. So we shouldn't accept that the worst impacts of climate hazards will come to pass, that there is a role for policy to play and there's a role for international donors to play in that process, but we have to have an understanding of the limits of influence, particularly on political inclusion. Not to say that nothing can be done by outsiders to foster political inclusion, but far more challenging. I have other policy implications that I'm happy to talk about, but I want to leave ample time for questions. So let me stop there and thank you for your attention.